To start with, we'd like to introduce you to an evolutionary mystery in spiral gingers. So here are 3 species of spiral gingers, and 2 of them, which are bird-pollinated, have really similar looking flowers. They're these yellow and orange things here, those are the flowers. And a 3rd species has really different looking flowers, and that one's pollinated by bees instead. So these ones look way more similar than the one in the middle, but when you look at where they live, it's actually the hummingbird pollinated flower and the bee pollinated flower that live close together. And the one that's sunbird pollinated lives all the way over here. And so the mystery is, how do these plants that live all the way across this ocean look so similar to each other? How do we go about answering questions like that?
So we study these types of questions by studying evolution, and understanding plant evolution is really important to learn more about biodiversity and recognizing new species. It gives us valuable knowledge on conservation efforts, how to improve it, and how to learn more about protecting biodiversity. Analyzing plants that grow in different regions and different climates over time throughout history show us how plants in the present day respond to changing climates and how the environment will look like in the future. Evolutionary biologists study phylogenetic trees, such as this one above, to learn more about how organisms relate to each other and how traits grow, or how traits are passed down. When students first learn about evolution, they oftentimes in elementary school, middle school, learn about flight. So this is a phylogenetic tree above, sorry. So this is the bird clade, hummingbirds and sunbirds, and they all have wings, they all fly, and these are the mammals. And what's interesting is that bats are the only mammals that are able to fly. So a good question to ask is, did the common ancestor share this trait of flying with both the hummingbirds, sunbirds, and bats? And to answer this, we look at the common ancestor of birds. We see, and we know for a fact that they were able to fly. And so this is an example of homology. On the other hand, when we look at the common ancestor of mammals, it did not fly. So this is an example of convergence, where a specific trait, for this case flying, is not passed down through a common ancestor to all the species. So how do we apply this information when studying cossus plants? And I'll give it over to Shayla.
With all of the things that come with it, right? Okay. So what about our mystery of look-alike flowers from across the ocean from each other? There's 2 ways that this could happen, right? We can think about that possibly the 2 plants that look very similar to each other are most closely related to each other, right? That makes a lot of sense, and that might be what you would think. But you also might think that the 2 plants that geographically are close to each other are most closely related to each other. You might live with your parents, but you might not live with your cousin, right? So geographically close might make a little bit more sense. So that's 2 hypotheses about their actual relationship, their evolutionary relationship. The next question is this idea of homology or convergence that Valerie just introduced us to. If in either case, we want to ask, did these traits get passed down from a common ancestor? So if these 2 are closely related to each other, it seems pretty likely that the common ancestor looked the same as these. And when something has a physical trait like that, we call it its morphology, if it looks similar. So we can ask, did the common ancestor look similar to these guys? And are these traits of this pollination syndrome, of these tubular yellow and orange flowers, are they homologous traits? Or we can ask the same thing in this sort of area, but the common ancestor would be further back at this node, right? Because we're looking at the ancestor of the two bird-pollinated species. So in order to answer these kinds of questions, we need to build a phylogenetic tree. And in our case, what we did is get as many species in the family as we could, with as many different pollination syndromes as we could find, and from as many different geographic locations as we could find. And so we build their relationships, a family tree like this. And the first thing you might notice is that way up here is the sunbird pollinated species, which Riva showed you is from Southeast Asia. And then down here, with all these little red birds, are the hummingbird pollinated species. And this entire clade here is all in Central and South America. And the little yellow things here are the bee pollinated species that are also in Central and South America. So that answers our first hypothesis. It was the one on the right, that the ones that are geographically close are more closely related to each other than the ones that are morphologically, and remember morphology is a physical trait, than the ones that are morphologically close to each other. And then we can ask, did these traits get passed down from a common ancestor? Are they homologous or are they convergent? And in that case, we want to look at the common ancestor. So if these are all the hummingbird pollinated species and this is the sunbird pollinated species, you follow the tree all the way back to where they meet, which is this most recent common ancestor of the bird pollinated species here. And to answer this question, we do something called ancestral state reconstruction. And we take information about the existing species and their morphology, their physical traits, and we apply some statistics to it. So we've got the math whiz over here, but we apply some statistics and we get an idea of what this ancestor most likely looked like. And in doing this process, we found that the common ancestor here was most likely not bird pollinated, and in fact was most likely pollinated by a generalist, meaning that it didn't have any of these physical traits that we associate with bee pollination or with bird pollination. And then additionally, we were able to see that you might notice that the hummingbird and the bee pollinated species are all mixed in with each other. So we can ask within this group, what was the ancestral state there? And we find that the ancestral state was a bee pollination syndrome. So not only did the bird pollination for sunbirds and for hummingbirds evolve independently and separately, but even within this clade, hummingbird pollination evolved multiple times independently. And this is almost like you and your first cousin twice removed looking like identical twins. It's pretty incredible. And it's a thing in evolution that really kind of defines and supports Darwin's theory of natural selection that you may have heard about. And we call this convergence as opposed to homology. And maybe Riva has a minute to tell us about how convergence might happen.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to finish with saying that we supported our second hypothesis.
So why does convergence happen? There are lots of different examples, and because I'm a plant biologist, I'm going to talk about one plant example. You might know that there are deserts in different parts of the world, right? There's deserts in the Americas, and there's deserts in Africa, for example. And plants that live in deserts often look really similar. A lot of times they have swollen parts that store a lot of water because it doesn't rain very often. And the reason why they convergently have those swollen parts to hold water is because they're experiencing really similar environmental pressures. So sometimes organisms that live under similar environmental pressures come up with very similar looking adaptations to deal with them. And that's one of the reasons why convergence can happen. So thanks so much for having us today. We're really excited about what questions you have for us.
Great, thank you for presenting. So if you want to maybe just come and stand a little bit closer over here. And you guys can answer with this mic. All right, so Jason, I know you read this paper. What did you think?
I really liked it, and there was only one tiny part that was a little confusing.
So polite. Okay, what is that? What was that?
It was just, how does it really work? It doesn't really show you how evolution came to work.
It's a good question.
That's a pretty good one.
Your question is, how does evolution work?
Yeah.
Well, other than saying ask your mom, we can ask that. So if you think about, this is what we were trying to explain a little bit with convergence, is that the hummingbirds are interested in flowers that fit with their beaks, right? And so if you look at the bee pollinated species, that we can bring back up the pictures, probably. If you're a bird with a long beak, you might poke through this flower here and destroy the flower, and you don't get any nectar, so you don't get to eat. So in that case, if you have a whole group of these plants and some of them are a little bit longer and skinnier, maybe those work a little bit better for you. And so you start to feed only on those that look they're a little bit easier for you, and you don't destroy them, right? And in that case, you start to pollinate only those and separate those ones out from the other groupings that are able to be pollinated by bees. So just by the ease, the ability to work with that plant, you start to separate it from the others, is the easiest way to try and describe it. I hope it made sense.
It's a good point, though, that maybe in a paper like this, we should have a little bit more of a foundation of the principles of evolution. It's not all individuals reading the papers will have come across them yet. So thank you, Jason. Do you have a follow-up question, or are you good? Okay, great. Any other questions? Darius? They're using the second mic, sorry.
In the modern world, there are many new technologies for gene editing, such as CRISPR. How do you think that will affect ancestral state reconstruction efforts in the future?
That's a great question, and CRISPR is a really new and exciting thing that's happening, and it's really cool that you know a lot about it. I think that it shouldn't probably affect anything because in the case of ancestral state reconstruction, you're looking at the population. So unless you were able to edit genomes, right, and put that out into the world and have that become an established population, then you wouldn't see it in natural populations.
But sometimes we can get confused with what ancestors looked like, especially when we're looking at agricultural plants, because humans had such a big role in changing what those plants looked like. And so when we try to figure out what their ancestors might have looked like, sometimes our statistics can be a little confusing because the selective pressures that happen in the environment are really different than the selective pressures that happen in farms.
So we have time for one more question.
So two people make a person. How is it only one flower that passes down its features to another flower?
So actually, when birds and bees pollinate these flowers, they go around, they go to different flowers, and they pick up pollen, and then they transfer it to different places. So these different traits that are picked up from individual flowers are spread multiple places all over wherever these birds and bees are flying. So it's not actually just one flower getting created at a time, but it's multiple everywhere. And then a lot of times these genes, and this is how flowers diversify and they mix in anyone.
And I think that's a really great point just in terminology. We say ancestral state reconstruction and the common ancestor, but it's not just one person, it's a huge population. So common ancestors may make more sense.
So what do you think? Is this a revise and resubmit, an outright reject, or a slip it right through accept? Wyatt, what do you think?
What were the options again?
Well, we can say we'll revise and resubmit, so they'll take into consideration your comments and submit a revision for your approval. Or we can accept as is if we think it's perfect, or we can reject because we think it has no potential.
I think you should accept because it's a pretty good article. I mean, they explained it pretty well, and the diagrams did fit with what they were talking about.
Okay, great. That's your reviewer number 2. Yeah. Who did a reviewer number 1? Does anybody? So the joke is that the reviewer number 1 is always the hard reviewer, and the reviewer number 2 gives the softer critique. Is there someone that feels that we should ask them for some revisions, or is everybody good accepting as is? Yeah. All right, thumbs up. Thank you.
Great, thank you guys.